I want to tell you something before I get into this story. I've gone back and forth about whether to share it at all. I've typed it out and deleted it more times than I can count. But here's the thing about carrying a truth this heavy. Eventually you stop being able to hold it alone. So here it is. My name is Rachel Shepard. I'm 32 years old. I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And the family I spent my entire life trying to hold together fell apart the moment they found out I had something worth taking. I want to be clear about something right from the start. This isn't a story about hating my family. It's not about revenge, not exactly. It's about what happens when the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally show you, without any room for doubt, that their love has always had a price tag attached to it. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending the price tag isn't there. If you've ever felt like the invisible one in your family, the one who keeps showing up even when nobody shows up for you, I think this story is going to hit close to home. Stick around because it gets worse before it gets better. And if stories like this one are why you're here, go ahead and subscribe. I put out new ones every week and I promise you this community is full of people who get it. Now let me take you back to a Tuesday in February. It's 6:47 in the morning and I'm driving to work on Market Street, the same route I've taken every single day for 4 years. I know every pothole, every traffic light, every turn. I've driven it in snowstorms, in fog, in the dark of January mornings when Portsmouth feels like the quietest city in the world. I could drive it in my sleep. That morning I almost did. I'd been pulling double shifts at Coastal Family Medicine for 2 weeks straight. Our practice had lost 2 physicians back to back, one to retirement and one to a hospital offer in Boston, and the rest of us had been covering the gaps without complaint because that's what you do when you care about your patients. I was a physician assistant, had been for 6 years, and I took that responsibility seriously, maybe more seriously than I took care of myself. That morning I was running on 4 hours of sleep, a gas station coffee, and the kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones. I was 3 blocks from the clinic when the other car ran the red light. I didn't even have time to brake. A gray pickup truck, moving fast, came through the intersection on Maplewood Avenue and hit the driver's side of my car so hard that the entire left side caved in like a tin can. I remember the sound first. Not a crash, more like an explosion, a wall of noise that wiped out every other thought. Then I remember the spinning, the way the world tilted sideways and kept going. Then nothing. Just black. I woke up in Portsmouth Regional Hospital 40 minutes later. At least that's what the nurse told me afterward. To me it felt like 1 second I was at that intersection and the next I was staring at a white ceiling with a tube in my arm and something pressing hard against my left side every time I tried to breathe. 2 fractured ribs. A dislocated shoulder. A moderate concussion. Lacerations on my forearm from the window glass. The attending physician, a man named Dr. Okafor, stood at the foot of my bed and listed my injuries the way you'd read off a grocery list, methodical and calm. "You're going to be here a few days," he said. "And then you're going to need to take it easy for a while." A few days. I looked at the empty room around me. No flowers. No coats draped over the visitor's chair. No half-eaten snacks on the side table that someone brought because they'd been there so long they got hungry. Just the room, the ceiling, the beeping monitors, and a nurse named Diane who came in every couple of hours to check on me with a quiet efficiency that felt, in those first hollow hours, like the closest thing to kindness I had. Diane was in her late 40s. Steady hands, no-nonsense manner, the kind of person who tells you the truth without softening it so much that it loses its shape. On my second morning she came in to check my vitals and I asked her, the way you ask a question when you already suspect the answer, "Has anyone called?" She didn't pause. Didn't look away. She just said, "We've had your emergency contact on file since admission. We reached your brother yesterday afternoon." I stared at the ceiling. And she adjusted the 4-line, straightened the blanket over my arm. "He said he'd pass the word along to your family. That was about 18 hours ago." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Here's what you need to understand about Matthias Shepard to understand any of what comes next. My brother is 4 years older than me, which made him the first one out of our childhood home on Beach Street and the first one to rewrite the story of where we came from. Growing up, our family didn't have much. Our father, Dennis Shepard, worked maintenance for the city. Our mother, Carol, cleaned houses 3 days a week and did alterations out of the spare bedroom the other 2. We weren't poor in the way that makes the news. We were poor in the quiet, grinding way, the way where you learn early not to ask for things because asking just makes everyone feel worse. Matthias handled our childhood by deciding he was going to leave it behind entirely. He was smart, focused, and relentlessly ambitious in a way that I used to admire and only later understood was something colder than ambition. He got a partial scholarship to UNH, worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, graduated with a finance degree, and spent the next decade climbing his way into a commercial real estate firm in Manchester. By the time he was 34, he had a townhouse, a company car, and a girlfriend named Sasha who wore her sunglasses indoors and called our mother Carol instead of Mrs. Shepherd. I took a different path. I stayed closer to home. Went to nursing school first, then bridged into the PA program at UNH's satellite campus. I moved back to Portsmouth because our parents were getting older and someone needed to be nearby. Matthias sent money occasionally, the way you throw a coin into a fountain, a gesture that costs you nothing and makes you feel generous. I brought groceries. I drove Mom to her appointments. I fixed the leak under the kitchen sink because Dad's knees had gotten bad enough that kneeling on tile was out of the question. I was the one who was there. And for a long time I told myself that was enough. That presence was its own reward. Our grandmother, Eleanor Shepherd, saw through Matthias in a way the rest of us were too close to manage. She lived in a little 2-story on Aldrich Road in Exeter, 20 minutes from Portsmouth, and every time I visited she'd hold my hand a beat too long and say, "Rachel, you give too much credit to people who show up only when it's convenient." I'd laugh it off. I thought she was just being a grandmother the way grandmothers sometimes see danger in everything. I know better now. Eleanor Shepherd was the sharpest person in our family by a distance, and she spent the last years of her life making sure the people who actually showed up were the ones who got taken care of. I was in my hospital room on the 3rd day, propped up against 2 pillows trying to eat lukewarm soup with my good arm, when my phone finally rang. Not Matthias. Not my mother. It was my co-worker Priya, who'd heard about the accident through the clinic's group chat and driven over on her lunch break with a tote bag full of things I didn't know I needed until she handed them to me. Phone charger. Dry shampoo. A novel she'd been meaning to lend me for months. She sat in the visitor's chair, the one that had been empty since I arrived, and she looked at me with the kind of direct, clear-eyed concern that doesn't ask permission and said, "Why hasn't anyone from your family been here?" I didn't have an answer. I'm still not sure I do. But that question sat in the room long after Priya left, and it was still sitting there when my brother finally called on day 4. Not to ask how I was. Not to say he was on his way. He called to ask, in that careful measured voice he uses when he's already rehearsed what he's going to say, whether I'd had any recent conversations with Grandma Eleanor's estate attorney. He said it casually, like it was an afterthought, like he was asking about the weather. I remember holding the phone against my ear with my good arm, ribs aching, shoulder in a sling, and thinking he didn't ask if I could breathe. He didn't ask if I was alone. He asked about the attorney. That was the moment everything shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a quiet, irreversible click, like a door locking from the outside. My brother hadn't called to check on his sister. He'd called because somewhere in the paperwork of our grandmother's estate, my name appeared next to a number that mattered to him. And he needed to know how much I knew before I had too much time to think about it. I told him I was fine, by the way. He didn't ask. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I kept replaying Matthias's voice on the phone, that careful, unhurried tone he uses when he's thinking 3 moves ahead. He'd always been like that. Even as a kid, Matthias never said anything without knowing exactly what he wanted back from it. I used to think that was a strength. Lying in that hospital bed with my shoulder throbbing and the monitors beeping in the dark, I finally understood it for what it actually was. The next morning, Diane came in earlier than usual. She checked my chart, adjusted the compression wrap on my arm, and then did something she hadn't done before. She pulled the visitor's chair closer to the bed and sat down. Not in a clinical way. In the way a person sits when they've decided to say something they're not technically required to say. She told me that a woman had called the nurse's station the previous evening asking about my condition and my expected discharge date. Not my prognosis. Not whether I was in pain. Just when I'd be leaving. I asked who it was. Diane said the woman gave her name as Carol Shepherd. My mother. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment. My mother had called the hospital to find out when I was being discharged. She hadn't asked to be transferred to my room. She hadn't asked a single question about my injuries. She had called to find out when the inconvenient part, the part where I was lying in a hospital bed needing something from people, would be over. Diane watched my face and said nothing. She was good at that, knowing when silence was the more honest response. That afternoon my cousin Joel showed up. Joel Shepherd, 30 years old, my Uncle Patrick's youngest, the one person in the extended family who had always operated on a frequency slightly removed from the rest of them. He worked as a contractor, drove a beat-up Ford, and had a habit of showing up exactly when you needed him without ever being asked. He walked into my room carrying a brown paper bag with a sandwich and a bag of chips from the deli on Congress Street, set it on my side table, looked me over once and said, "You look terrible." I said, "I know." He sat down. We didn't say anything for a minute. Then he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before Matthias gets to you first." I put the sandwich down. Joel is not a dramatic person. He doesn't build up to things or choose his moments for effect. When Joel says he needs to tell you something, he means it, and it's never small. He told me that 3 days ago, the day after my accident, Matthias had called a family meeting. Not at the hospital. Not anywhere near me. At our parents' house on Beach Street, in the living room where we grew up, with our mother and father and Uncle Patrick and Aunt Renee all seated around the coffee table like it was a board meeting. Joel had been there because his father was there, not because he was invited. According to Joel, Matthias had opened the meeting by saying that given Rachel's condition and the uncertainty around her recovery, it was important for the family to get organized. That was the word he used. Organized. He'd brought a folder, an actual folder with printed pages inside, and he'd walked them through the basics of Grandma Eleanor's estate. The property on Aldrich Road in Exeter. The savings accounts. The investment portfolio she'd been quietly building since the 1980s. He told them the estate was valued at somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million depending on current market assessments. And then he said the part that made Joel set down his coffee and stare at his own hands. He said that Eleanor's will, as currently written, left the majority of the liquid assets to Rachel. Not split evenly. Not divided among the family. To Rachel. And he said it the way you'd report a problem, not a fact. I didn't say anything for a long time after Joel finished. The monitors beeped. Someone in the hallway laughed at something. Through the window I could see the gray February sky pressing flat against the rooftops of Portsmouth. I asked Joel why Grandma would have done it that way, even though somewhere underneath the shock I already knew. Joel looked at me carefully and said, "Because you were the one who was there, Rachel. Every Sunday dinner. Every hospital appointment. Every time she needed a ride or someone to sit with her when the nights got long. Matthias showed up at Christmas and sent flowers on her birthday. You showed up on a Tuesday in October because she mentioned she hadn't been sleeping well. You know why she left it to you?" I did know. I just hadn't known until that moment that Matthias knew too. And that he'd had a folder about it ready to present to our parents before I'd even been discharged from the hospital. Here's what made it worse. And I want you to understand, I'm not someone who looks for the worst in people. I spent years actively choosing not to see the worst in Matthias because he was my brother and because I remembered who he was before ambition hollowed him out. But what Joel told me next took away the last cushion of doubt I'd been holding on to. At the family meeting, Matthias had suggested that given the complexity of the estate and Rachel's current medical situation, it might be worth consulting a lawyer about whether a formal conservatorship arrangement might be appropriate. A conservatorship. For a woman with 2 cracked ribs and a shoulder injury. A woman who had been unconscious for less than an hour and was sitting up, talking and eating hospital food by the following morning. Joel said the word landed in the room and nobody pushed back. Our father had nodded slowly. Our mother had looked at her hands. Uncle Patrick had asked what a conservatorship would actually involve, which was the closest anyone got to a question. Matthias had explained calmly and thoroughly that it would give a designated family member legal authority to manage financial affairs on behalf of someone deemed temporarily unable to do so themselves. He already had a name ready. His own. I looked at Joel. He looked at me. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate to that moment, so neither of us tried. He reached over, picked up the sandwich from the table and handed it back to me. "Eat something," he said. "You're going to need to be sharp." I ate the sandwich. It was turkey and Swiss on sourdough and it was the best thing I'd tasted in 4 days. Not because it was remarkable but because someone who actually cared about me had gone out of their way to get it. That contrast between the folder Matthias had prepared and the sandwich Joel had carried across town said everything about those two people that I had been too comfortable for too long to say out loud. That evening I called Grandma Eleanor's estate attorney myself. His name was Warren Cutler, and he had an office on Islington Street that I'd been to twice before with Eleanor when she was updating her documents in the last year of her life. He picked up on the second ring. I told him who I was and that I was calling from the hospital. He already knew about the accident. Eleanor had spoken about me often enough that Warren Cutler knew exactly who I was without needing clarification, and that alone told me something important. He told me the will was clear and legally sound. He told me that Eleanor had updated it 14 months before her death and that it had been witnessed, notarized, and filed correctly. He told me there was no ambiguity in the language. And then he said something that I've thought about nearly every day since. He said, "Your grandmother was very deliberate about this, Rachel. She told me she wanted to make sure the right person was protected. She used that word specifically. Protected." I hung up and sat with that for a long time. Protected. Eleanor had known something I hadn't fully admitted to myself. She had known that the moment there was something to take, the people who hadn't been there would suddenly find their way to the room. She had seen it clearly enough to build a legal wall around me before she was gone. She had done the one thing she could do from a hospice bed in Exeter, New Hampshire, and she had done it 14 months out because she was the sharpest person in our family and she didn't leave things to chance. I didn't call Matthias back that night. I didn't call my parents. I lay in the dark and I thought about Eleanor on her front porch on Aldrich Road, drinking her evening tea with both hands wrapped around the mug, telling me once that loyalty is just love with its boots on. I hadn't understood what she meant then. I understood it completely now. She had loved me with her boots on for years. And my brother had just walked into a room full of our family with a folder and a plan, 3 days after my accident, while I was still in a hospital bed that none of them had come to sit beside. And the part that I couldn't shake, the part that kept me awake long after the ward went quiet, was that not one of them, not my mother, not my father, not my uncle or my aunt, had thought to ask whether I was okay before asking what I was worth. But tomorrow that was going to change. Because I had just gotten off the phone with Warren Cutler and I had a plan of my own forming. Warren Cutler called me back the following morning before I'd even finished my breakfast. He didn't waste time on pleasantries, which I appreciated more than I could say at that point. He told me that Matthias had contacted his office 2 days prior, the day after my accident, asking to schedule a consultation regarding the Eleanor Shepherd estate. Warren had declined the meeting on the grounds that Matthias was not a named party in the will and had no standing to initiate proceedings. But the call itself told Warren everything he needed to know about the direction things were heading. He said, "I want you to retain separate legal counsel, Rachel. Not because the will is vulnerable, it isn't. But because your brother is going to keep pushing until someone pushes back with enough force that he stops." I was discharged from Portsmouth Regional that same afternoon. Dr. Okafor went through the discharge instructions with the measured patience of a man who has given them 1,000 times. Rest. Limited movement of the left shoulder for 6 weeks. Follow up with orthopedics in 10 days. No lifting, no driving for 2 weeks. He handed me the paperwork and said, "Do you have someone picking you up?" I said yes. I called Priya. She came without hesitation, pulled up to the entrance in her green Subaru with a travel mug of tea in the cup holder and an audiobook already queued up for the drive because she knew I wouldn't want to talk. That was Priya. She understood the shape of what you needed without you having to draw it. She drove me back to my apartment on Deer Street. 3rd floor walk-up, 1 bedroom, a small kitchen with a window that looked out over the rooftops toward the harbor. I had lived there for 4 years and it had always felt like mine in the way that matters, the way where you walk through the door and your shoulders drop a half inch because you're somewhere safe. That afternoon it felt different. Smaller. I put my bag down, sat on the couch, and for the first time since the accident I let myself feel the full weight of it. Not the physical pain, I was managing that. The other weight. The kind that doesn't show up on an X-ray. Matthias called at 6 that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 6:15. Voicemail again. At 6:30 he sent a text that said, "Rachel, I know you're home. We need to talk about Grandma's estate before things get complicated." I read it twice, set the phone face down on the coffee table and went to make tea. I want you to notice what he didn't say. He didn't say, "I'm glad you're out of the hospital." He didn't say, "Let me know if you need anything." He said, "We need to talk before things get complicated." As if the complication was the estate and not the fact that his sister had just spent 5 days in a hospital room that he never walked into. The next morning I called the attorney Warren had recommended. Her name was Sylvia Orant, and she had a practice on State Street specializing in estate litigation and probate disputes. I'd looked her up the night before. 15 years of experience. A reputation according to the reviews I found for being methodical, direct and very difficult to rattle. She had a cancellation that afternoon and told me to come in. Joel drove me since I wasn't cleared to drive yet. He waited in the lobby without complaint, scrolling his phone and eating a granola bar, while I sat across from Sylvia Orant for an hour and told her everything. Sylvia listened without interrupting, which in my experience is rare and always a good sign. She took notes in a small leather notebook with a pen that she clicked once at the start and once at the end of each session of writing, a small precise habit that made me feel like I was in capable hands. When I finished, she looked over her notes, clicked the pen once and said, "Your brother has no legal standing to challenge this will on the current facts." Eleanor Shepard was of sound mind when she updated it. The document is properly executed. He knows that. So what he's doing instead is building a different kind of case. She explained it to me plainly. Matthias wasn't trying to break the will directly. He was trying to establish that I was incapable of managing the inheritance, so that a court would appoint a conservator to manage it on my behalf. And he had positioned himself as the obvious candidate for that role. I asked her what he would need to prove that. She said he'd need medical documentation suggesting cognitive or functional impairment, statements from family members supporting that assessment, and ideally a pattern of behavior that could be characterized as erratic or unstable. I thought about the family meeting Joel had described. I thought about my mother calling the hospital to ask about discharge dates. I thought about the text from Matthias that evening, angled and careful. And I understood that the infrastructure for exactly that case had been quietly under construction since the day after my accident, while I was still attached to a monitor and counting ceiling tiles. Sylvia filed a formal notice of representation with Warren Cutler's office that same day, establishing that I was legally competent, fully represented, and that any attempt to initiate conservatorship proceedings without my consent would be contested immediately and aggressively. She also sent a letter to Matthias directly through his home address, informing him that all further communication regarding the Eleanor Shepard estate was to be directed to her office. Joel told me later that Matthias had called their father after receiving that letter. He said Matthias's voice had a quality to it Joel had never heard before. Not anger, something tighter than anger. The sound of a plan hitting a wall it hadn't accounted for. 3 days after I got home, my parents came to my apartment. I want to be precise about the sequence here because the sequence matters. They did not come to the hospital while I was injured. They did not call to check on me when I was discharged. They came to my apartment on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after I got out, 2 days after Matthias received Sylvia's letter. My mother brought a container of soup. My father stood behind her in the doorway holding his hat in both hands like a man waiting to be let in from the cold. I stepped back and let them in because they were my parents and I wasn't ready yet to be done with that. We sat in the living room. My mother set the soup on the coffee table and looked around the apartment the way she always did, taking inventory of the small details. The books on the shelf, the plant on the windowsill, the throw on the arm of the couch. My father sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then my mother said we should have come to the hospital. I know that. I'm sorry. My father nodded without looking up. I looked at them both. These were not bad people. I want to be clear about that because this story is not about cartoon villains. My parents were people who had spent 30 years defaulting to the loudest voice in the room. And Matthias had always been the loudest voice. They hadn't come to the hospital because Matthias had framed my situation as handled, managed, organized, and they had believed him the way they always believed him because believing him was easier than asking questions. That was the pattern. It had been the pattern my entire life. Matthias made the decisions and my parents ratified them without reading the fine print. And I had been the fine print for as long as I could remember. I told them what Joel had told me. The family meeting. Folder. The conservatorship proposal. I told them about the call Matthias had made to Warren Cutler's office the day after my accident. I told them about Sylvia Orant and the letter. My mother's face went through several changes while I spoke. My father's went very still. When I finished, he finally looked up and said he told us he was taking care of things. I said, Dad, he was taking care of himself. There's a difference. My mother cried quietly into a tissue she'd had folded in her sleeve the way she always kept one. My father set his hat on the coffee table and rubbed his face with both hands. I didn't comfort them. I'm not proud of that, but I didn't have anything left to spare right then. I had 2 healing ribs, a shoulder that ached every time I reached for something, a legal situation that was going to require my full attention, and a brother who had spent the week since my accident quietly trying to take my inheritance while I was lying in a bed he'd never visited. I was 32 years old and I was sitting in my own living room feeling like the orphan of a family that was still technically alive. There was no comfort I could manufacture for that moment that would have been honest. My father left first. He paused at the door and said, "I'll talk to Matthias." I didn't tell him not to. I didn't tell him to either. I just said, "Okay, Dad." My mother hugged me carefully around the bad shoulder and held on for a beat too long, the way you hold on when you know you've missed something you can't get back. After they left, I sat in the quiet for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Sylvia Orant. Because whatever my father said to Matthias that evening, I already knew it wouldn't be enough. Matthias wasn't going to stop because his father asked him to. He was going to stop because I made it impossible for him to continue. And I was just getting started. Sylvia called me on a Monday morning with the kind of controlled urgency that told me she'd been up early working on something she didn't want to sit on. She said Matthias had retained a probate attorney named Gregory Falk, out of a firm in Concord that handled contested estate cases. She'd pulled Falk's recent filings and recognized the pattern immediately. He had a history of building conservatorship arguments around medical events, using the window right after an injury or illness when documentation was thin and family dynamics were unstable. He was good at it. He said it plainly, the way you acknowledge a worthy opponent without flinching. He's good at this, Rachel. Which means we need to be better. She had already begun pulling together a counterfile. Dr. Okafor's discharge notes confirming I had been alert, oriented and cognitively intact throughout my hospital stay. A letter from Warren Cutler confirming Eleanor's deliberate and sound intentions when updating the will. Diane's contact information as a potential witness to the fact that no family member had visited during my admission. And she wanted one more thing. She wanted a formal psychological evaluation, voluntary, initiated by me, conducted by a licensed neuropsychologist of my choosing, to establish on record that I was fully competent. Not because the law required it, but because it would make Falk's conservatorship argument collapse before it ever reached a judge. I agreed without hesitation. If Matthias wanted to tell a story about an unstable, impaired sister, I was going to make sure every page of the factual record told a different one. The evaluation was scheduled for the following Thursday at a practice in Dover. In the meantime, Matthias made his next move. Joel called me 2 days before the appointment to tell me that Matthias had been making the rounds. He had visited Uncle Patrick and Aunt Renee at their house in Newington. He had taken our mother to lunch at a restaurant on Bow Street, just the two of them. He had called 2 of our parents' longtime family friends, a couple named the Dorseys who had known us since we were children, and had what Joel described as a long conversation about how worried the family was about Rachel and how the accident had affected her more than she was letting on. He was building his witness list in plain sight, collecting soft endorsements from people who loved him and trusted his version of events because he'd always been the one who seemed to have everything figured out. I want to tell you what that felt like because I think it's important to be honest about this part. It wasn't pure anger. Anger is clean and simple and I could have worked with pure anger. What I actually felt was something more complicated and more exhausting. It was the specific grief of watching someone dismantle your credibility with people who've known you your whole life, people who held you as a baby and came to your graduation and hugged you at Eleanor's funeral, and knowing that their good opinion of you is being quietly redirected, one lunch and one phone call at a time, by someone who never missed a chance to look capable in front of an audience. Sylvia had told me not to engage with Matthias directly. No calls, no texts, no confrontations. Let the legal process do its work and don't give him anything he can reframe. I followed that instruction and it was one of the hardest things I have done, sitting on my couch with my shoulder in a sling and my phone in my hand, watching the read receipts stack up under messages I wasn't sending. But I followed it. Because Sylvia was right, and because I had learned by then that Matthias was significantly better than me at converting emotional reactions into strategic advantages. My restraint was the one thing he hadn't planned for. The psychological evaluation took 2.5 hours. Dr. Anita Foss conducted it, a quiet, precise woman in her 50s who asked questions that seemed simple on the surface and were anything but. Memory, reasoning, executive function, emotional regulation, judgment under stress. She didn't tell me the results that day. She said her written report would be ready within a week and would be sent directly to my attorney. I drove home afterward, made dinner, watched the harbor lights come on through my kitchen window, and told myself that whatever happened next, I had done everything I could do with the time and information I had. That was the only kind of control I actually owned. The report landed in Sylvia's inbox 6 days later. She called me the same afternoon. Sylvia is not an effusive person. She communicates in precise measured sentences and she doesn't use superlatives casually. So when she said this is exactly what we needed, I understood the weight of it. Dr. Foss had found no evidence of cognitive impairment, no markers of trauma-related dysfunction affecting judgment or decision-making, and had noted explicitly that the subject demonstrated above-average capacity for clear reasoning under emotionally complex circumstances. Sylvia was going to attach it to a formal response to Gregory Fawkes' office, along with Dr. Okafor's discharge notes and Warren Cutler's statement. She said after he reads this, any competent attorney will advise his client to walk away from the conservatorship angle. 2 days later Joel called me again. Matthias had pivoted. He had dropped the conservatorship approach at least for now and had shifted to a different strategy entirely. He had filed a formal challenge to the will itself, not on the grounds of Rachel's competency but on the grounds of undue influence. He was claiming that I had manipulated Eleanor in the final years of her life, leveraging my proximity and her increasing dependence to pressure her into changing the will in my favor. He had a timeline prepared, cross-referencing my visits to Exeter with the dates of Eleanor's will revisions. He had a statement from Aunt Renee who had apparently told Matthias that Eleanor had seemed very reliant on Rachel near the end, almost too reliant. He was reframing every Sunday dinner and every Tuesday afternoon I had ever spent on Aldrich Road as evidence of manipulation. Every act of care had been turned into a transaction. Every hour I had given had been converted into an allegation. I sat with that for a long time after Joel hung up. Outside my window Portsmouth was doing what Portsmouth does in early March, gray sky, cold harbor, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's being seen through gauze. I thought about Eleanor the last winter of her life. I thought about driving to Exeter on a Thursday evening because she had called to say the furnace was making a noise she didn't recognize and she didn't want to bother anyone. I had looked at the furnace, which turned out to be fine, eaten the pasta she'd made from scratch despite my telling her not to go to the trouble, and driven home at 10 o'clock in the dark. I thought about Matthias sending a fruit basket at Christmas. I thought about undue influence. I thought about what it means to take the most ordinary human decency and hold it up in front of a judge as evidence of wrongdoing. I called Sylvia and told her what Joel had said before she'd even had a chance to call me. She had already heard from Warren Cutler. She was already preparing the response. She told me to pull together everything I had. Text messages with Eleanor. Emails. Any cards or letters. Photographs with dates. She had a list of people who had witnessed my relationship with Eleanor over the years. Neighbors on Aldrich Road, Eleanor's doctor, the woman at the library in Exeter who had known Eleanor for 20 years and had seen us there together on Saturday mornings. She said the undue influence claim was a longer fight than the conservatorship approach, but it was also a weaker one because it required Matthias to convince a judge that Eleanor Shepherd, a woman of documented intelligence and fierce independence, had been a passive victim of her own granddaughter's scheming. Then Sylvia said something that landed differently than the rest. She said, "Rachel, I've been doing this for 15 years and I want to tell you something I don't always say to clients this early. Your brother is not going to win this. He doesn't have the evidence because the evidence doesn't exist. What he has is noise and persistence and a family that's been conditioned to defer to him. But noise doesn't hold up in a courtroom and persistence runs out when the bills start coming. What you have is the truth and a paper trail that supports it completely. That's not nothing. That's everything." I thanked her and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about Eleanor's hands, how they felt when she held mine the last time I saw her, papery and warm and deliberate, like she was pressing something into my palm that she needed me to keep safe. She had known this was coming. Not the specific shape of it but the general outline of it. She had updated her will 14 months before she died. She had chosen Warren Cutler, a meticulous and unshakable attorney, to manage it. She had told him she wanted me protected. She had done everything she could from her side of it. Now it was my turn to do everything I could from mine. And for the first time since the accident, since the empty hospital room and the phone call about the estate attorney and the folder and the conservatorship and the character assassination being quietly assembled one family lunch at a time, I felt something settle inside me. Not peace exactly. More like certainty. The kind that doesn't need anyone else to confirm it. Matthias had made one miscalculation at the center of all of this. He had assumed that because I had always been quiet I had nothing to say. He was about to find out how wrong that was. Sylvia scheduled a mediation session for the 3rd week of March. This was her idea, not mine, and when she first proposed it I pushed back. I didn't want to sit across a table from Matthias and negotiate something that wasn't his to negotiate in the first place. Sylvia understood that. He said, I know. But mediation gives us something a courtroom doesn't. It gives us a controlled environment where Matthias has to show his hand completely, with his attorney present and a neutral mediator recording everything, and where his argument has to survive actual scrutiny instead of just family dinners. If he walks in with what he has right now, he walks out with nothing and a legal bill. Let him do that in a room where it counts. He was right. I knew she was right. So I said yes. The mediation took place at an office on Middle Street, a neutral suite that belonged to neither attorney, rented specifically for proceedings like this one. I arrived with Sylvia at 9 in the morning. The room had a long rectangular table, 8 chairs, a window overlooking the street, and the particular stillness of a place that exists only for disagreements. Matthias was already there when we walked in. He was wearing a charcoal suit I didn't recognize, which meant he'd bought it recently, which meant he'd prepared for this the way he prepared for business meetings, as a performance of authority. His attorney Gregory Fox sat beside him, a compact man in his 60s with the alert stillness of someone who had been in these rooms many times and had learned not to waste energy before it was needed. Matthias looked at me when I walked in. I looked back. He had the expression he wore when he was working hard to appear relaxed, jaw slightly loose, hands flat on the table, the careful performance of a man who has nothing to hide. I had grown up with that expression. I knew exactly what it meant. I sat down across from him and set my hands in my lap and waited. The mediator, a woman named Patricia Slade, opened the session by outlining the purpose and the ground rules. Each party would have uninterrupted time to present their position. The goal was resolution without litigation. Everything said in this room was confidential unless an agreement was reached and memorialized. She was calm and precise and clearly had no interest in the emotional texture of the situation, only the facts and whether they could be shaped into an outcome both parties could live with. Gregory Fox went first. He laid out the undue influence argument with the efficiency of a man who had assembled it carefully. Rachel Shepard had been Eleanor Shepard's primary caregiver in the final 2 years of her life. Eleanor had been increasingly isolated from other family members during that period. The will revision had taken place during a time of documented physical decline. The distribution was disproportionate in a way that deviated sharply from Eleanor's previously expressed wishes to treat her grandchildren equally. He cited Aunt Renee's statement. He cited a handwritten note Eleanor had apparently sent Matthias 3 years ago that mentioned wanting to be fair to both of you. He made it sound reasonable. He made it sound like concern. When it was Sylvia's turn, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform outrage. She opened her folder and went through the counter evidence the way you'd read a list of documented facts to someone who had asked for them. Eleanor's medical records showing consistent cognitive clarity throughout the period in question. Dr. Okafor's notes. The psychological evaluation from Dr. Foss. Warren Cutler's detailed account of Eleanor's instructions when revising the will, including her explicit and unprompted statement that the revision reflected her own considered judgment and no one else's influence. Testimony from Eleanor's neighbor on Aldrich Road, who had known her for 30 years and had offered a written statement describing Eleanor as sharp, decisive, and fully in command of her own affairs until the final weeks of her life. And then the text messages. 2 years of them. Eleanor and I, back and forth, ordinary and unremarkable in the way that real relationships are, talking about her garden, her book club, the bird feeder she wanted to move to the south side of the yard because the light was better there in the afternoons. None of it looked like manipulation. All of it looked like love. Falk glanced at Matthias once during Sylvia's presentation. Just once, briefly, and then looked away. That was enough. Patricia Slade called a 15-minute break. Matthias and Falk stepped into the hallway. Sylvia poured herself a glass of water and looked at me and said nothing because there was nothing necessary to say. Through the window I could see the street below. Ordinary Portsmouth going about its ordinary Tuesday. People walking dogs, a delivery truck idling at the curb. The city indifferent to the fact that something important was being decided one floor up. When Matthias came back into the room he sat down without looking at me. Falk informed Patricia Slade that his client wished to discuss a potential resolution. What followed was 40 minutes of negotiation that I am going to condense because the details are tedious and the outcome is what matters. Matthias withdrew the undue influence claim. In exchange, Sylvia agreed on my behalf that I would not pursue legal costs against him, which she had advised me was the pragmatic choice given that recovering those costs would require further litigation and further time, and I had already spent enough of both. Matthias signed the withdrawal documentation at 11:47 in the morning. He capped the pen, pushed the papers across the table, and stood up without a word to me. He walked out of the room and I heard his footsteps in the hallway and then the elevator and then nothing. I sat at the table for a moment after he left. Patricia Slade gathered her materials with quiet efficiency. Sylvia slid the signed documents into her folder. Outside on the street, the delivery truck had moved on. I thought about the drive to that intersection on Maplewood Avenue 6 weeks ago. The gray pickup running the red light. The sound of everything collapsing. I thought about waking up in a white room alone. I thought about Matthias's voice on the phone asking about the estate attorney while I was still in a sling. I thought about the folder. The family meeting I hadn't been invited to. The conservatorship proposal with his own name ready. The lunches and the phone calls and the witness list assembled from people who loved him. All of it, every calculated move, withdrawn with the cap of a pen on a Tuesday morning because when the noise stopped there was nothing underneath it. Just a man who had wanted something that was never his and had run out of ways to take it. That evening Joel came over. He brought pizza from the place on Hanover Street that we'd been ordering from since we were teenagers, and we sat at my kitchen table and ate it straight from the box the way you do when you don't want to pretend the occasion is more formal than it is. He asked how I felt. I told him I didn't know yet. He said that was probably the right answer. We ate in comfortable silence for a while. The kind that only exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. Then Joel said, "You know what the worst part is?" I asked what. He said, "I don't think he ever thought he'd lose." I thought about that. I thought about Matthias at the table that morning, charcoal suit, hands flat, the performance of a man with nothing to hide. I thought about him walking out without a word. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't acknowledged anything. He had simply run out of moves and left the room. That was the part that stayed with me, not the victory of the withdrawal or the relief of the legal threat being gone, but the absence of any moment of recognition from him. No reckoning. No accounting. Just the click of an elevator and the sound of someone leaving a room they should never have entered. My mother called that night. She had heard from my father, who had heard from Uncle Patrick that the mediation had concluded. He asked how I was. Her voice had a careful quality, like she was holding something fragile and wasn't sure of her grip. I told her I was fine. There was a silence, longer than a pause, shorter than a goodbye. Then she said, "Rachel, I want you to know that I understand now why you were angry." I wasn't going to correct her on the word angry because what I had been was not angry, it was something larger and more structural than anger, but I understood what she was trying to say and I appreciated the effort it had cost her to say it. I told her I knew. Another silence. She said, "What happens now?" I told her the truth. "I don't know yet, Mom. I'm going to take some time and figure that out." She said okay. She said good night. I said good night back. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my apartment, the harbor lights doing what they always do, steady and indifferent and reliable in a way I had come to find genuinely comforting over the years. The inheritance was secure. The legal threat was gone. My brother had walked out of a mediation room with nothing. And I was sitting in my kitchen on Deer Street, shoulders still aching, ribs still tender, eating leftover pizza with a cousin who had shown up with a sandwich when nobody else showed up at all. I didn't feel like I had won something. I felt like I had survived something. And I was beginning to understand that those two things, winning and surviving, were not the same, and that surviving when it's all you had was more than enough. October in Portsmouth is the kind of beautiful that feels almost unfair. The harbor goes gold in the afternoon light. The maples lining the streets turn colors that don't seem possible outside of a painting, and the air has that sharp clarity that makes everything look more defined than it did in summer, like the world has taken a breath and held it. I've lived here my whole life and I still stop sometimes on my walk to work and just stand there for a long moment. Not because it's new. Because I finally have the quiet inside me to actually see it the way it has always deserved to be seen. I went back to Coastal Family Medicine in late April, 6 weeks after the mediation. Linda, the front desk receptionist who has worked there longer than any of the physicians, handed me a coffee when I walked through the door and said, "Welcome back, we saved your parking spot." Nobody gathered in the hallway. Nobody made a speech or arranged any kind of moment around it. It was just Tuesday and there were patients and I was a PA who was good at her job and the work was waiting right where I had left it. That was exactly what I needed. I put my bag down and got to it without any ceremony at all. The shoulder took longer to heal than the ribs. Orthopedics cleared me in stages and for a while certain movements still caught me off guard. Reaching overhead, turning too quickly, the reminder that the body keeps its own schedule regardless of what your plans say. Physical therapy ran through June. My therapist, a pragmatic woman named Greta with the bedside manner of a hockey coach and zero patience for self-pity, told me on my last session that I had been one of her more compliant patients, which she said was genuinely rarer than people assumed. I thanked her and meant every word of it. Joel and I have dinner most Thursdays. Not because we planned it, it just settled into a habit the way good things do, quietly and without ceremony. Sometimes it's the pizza place on Hanover Street. Sometimes it's whatever I have in the refrigerator and he doesn't complain. He finished a renovation in Newmarket in September and started a smaller one in Kittery the week after. We don't talk about Matthias. There is nothing useful left to say and we both understand that without needing to put it into words. Priya got engaged in July. Her partner proposed on a hiking trail in the White Mountains and she came into the clinic Monday morning with the ring and the story and that radiant disbelief of someone who has been handed exactly what they wanted and hasn't quite caught up to the reality of it yet. I hugged her in the break room and meant every bit of it. She is the kind of person who shows up with a tote bag of exactly the right things when you are lying in a hospital bed that nobody else has walked into, without being asked and without expecting anything back. Those people are rare. I know that now in a way I didn't fully know before February. My parents are a work in progress. That is the most honest description I have and I've decided honest is the only way I'm willing to describe things anymore. My mother calls every Sunday at noon and the calls have gotten longer, gradually and then noticeably. We've moved past the garden and the clinic and into actual conversation, the kind that has weight and texture, where one of us says something real and the other responds to the actual thing instead of the managed version. It is slow. It is incomplete. But it is genuine and genuine I've learned is worth considerably more than polished. My father quit drinking in May. He didn't announce it, which was entirely consistent with who he has always been. He just stopped quietly, the same stubbornness that caused damage for years now pointed in a useful direction. The first time I visited and he put the kettle on instead of reaching for a glass, I didn't say anything. He didn't either. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about the Red Sox and the furnace and whether the back steps needed replacing before the snow. It was an unremarkable conversation. It was one of the best I can remember having with him in years. Matthias and I have not spoken since the mediation room. I don't know the full shape of his life now beyond what surfaces through the family, that he is still in Manchester, that Sasha moved out over the summer, that the firm reassigned him to a smaller portfolio. I don't seek information about him and I don't turn it away when it arrives. He is my brother and that fact does not stop being true because of what he chose to do. But a fact and a relationship are not the same thing. The fact remains. The relationship, the one I kept rebuilding every time he let me down because I needed it to be real, that one I have had to grieve. Grief I have learned does not finish on schedule and shows up in the most ordinary moments without warning. I'll be driving to work and something will move through me and I will know what it is and I will let it sit there and then it passes and I keep driving. Eleanor's estate settled in September. Warren Cutler called on a Thursday morning to confirm the final transfer. The property on Aldrich Road sold to a young couple from Boston who had driven through Exeter on a weekend trip and fallen in love with the house before they had even parked the car. That is exactly who Eleanor would have chosen for it. The proceeds came to just over $900,000 after all legal fees and costs. Sylvia's invoice was not modest and I paid it without a single moment of resentment because what she did during those weeks was worth every dollar and considerably more. I used a portion of the inheritance to establish the Eleanor Shepherd Fund through the Seacoast Community Foundation, an endowment providing annual grants to family caregivers in Rockingham County. People doing exactly what I did for Eleanor, showing up on a Tuesday because she mentioned something wasn't right, staying through the evening, driving home in the dark and coming back the following week without being asked and without anyone noticing. Eleanor noticed. Every ordinary Tuesday of it. The fund is her way of making sure that kind of unglamorous reliable love gets acknowledged from a distance. Every year when the grants go out I think about the word she used with Warren Cutler. Practed. She meant it in both directions and I intend to honor it for as long as I am able. Diane retired from Portsmouth Regional in August and moved to the coast of Maine with her husband to be closer to their grandchildren. I sent her a card. I wrote that she had been kinder to me in 5 days than most people manage across a lifetime, which is simply true, and that I hoped Maine gave her everything she deserved. She sent one back. Her handwriting was small and precise, exactly what I would have predicted. She wrote, "The ones who make it really make it, are the ones who learn to tell the difference between the people who show up and the people who show up for something. You learn that. That is everything." I keep the card in the drawer of my nightstand. I don't take it out often, but knowing it is there is enough. I drove to Eleanor's grave in Exeter on a Saturday morning in October. The frost was still on the grass at 9 o'clock and the sky was that deep particular blue that only appears in autumn when the cold makes color look saturated and more real than usual. I brought white chrysanthemums because October called for something that could hold its shape against the temperature without flinching. I set them in the stone vase at the base of the headstone and stood there with my hands in my coat pockets and said what I needed to say out loud, because Eleanor always told me that things you only think stay small but things you say out loud become real and stay that way. I told her the fund was established and the first grants go out in the spring. I told her the house sold to good people who will take care of it the way it deserves. I told her Warren Cutler had been exactly as steady as she knew he would be when she chose him. I told her Sylvia Orant was the kind of attorney she would have respected immediately and befriended shortly after. I told her Joel was good, that Priya was engaged, that my father had stopped drinking, that my mother and I were rebuilding things one honest Sunday call at a time. I told her I was okay. Not the version that deflects or performs. The real version, the kind that lives in your chest like something solid and doesn't collapse when you press on it. I told her I finally understood what she had been trying to tell me all those years about giving too much credit to people who only appear when there is something in it for them. I told her I kept her handwriting in my wallet, a grocery list she had written me once on an ordinary Tuesday, just milk and eggs and the specific tea that only the shop on Water Street in Exeter carried. I kept it not because it said anything profound but because it was her handwriting on an unremarkable afternoon, evidence that she had existed and trusted me completely to show up for her without ever being asked. That felt worth carrying close every single day. The frost had melted off the grass by the time I walked back to the car. The oaks along the perimeter were holding their last leaves, amber and gold and stubborn in the way of things that know the season is ending and are not in any hurry. I sat for a long moment before starting the engine. I thought about the intersection on Maplewood Avenue, the gray truck, the white ceiling, the empty chair in the corner of a hospital room, the folder on the coffee table in a living room I grew up in, the mediation room on Middle Street and the sound of footsteps going down a hallway until there was nothing left to hear. And I thought about Diane's card sitting quietly in my nightstand drawer. The ones who make it really make it, are the ones who learn to tell the difference between the people who show up and the people who show up for something. I started the car and drove back toward Portsmouth past the stone walls and the quiet farms and the roadside stands selling the very last of the autumn apples. The whole drive I felt something I had not felt in a long time, longer than I had realized until it came back to me, the specific clean lightness of someone who has finally set down a weight they carried so long they forgot it was never supposed to belong to them. The road was clear. The morning was cold and bright and steady in the way of things you can depend on. I had somewhere to be and people who would genuinely notice if I didn't arrive. And for the first time in longer than I could honestly measure, that was not just enough. That was everything. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.